yeah, it's a real honour to be joined by Leon today. I'm just going to read Leon's bio. So Leon Sealey-Huggins is lead researcher and a co-founder of Breathe, community organising for climate justice. Leon is working for Breathe while on a career break from the University of Warwick, where he is assistant professor of global sustainable development. His scholarship and activism focuses on climate justice, asking what kinds of societies we must co-create as we face up to climate breakdown. Leon considers the sociology and politics of the climate crisis, investigating what climate justice means in the context of global, historical, and present inequalities. Leon is currently working on a book about social collapse in the UK. I'm just going to move the mic over to Ma, who's going to set a little bit of context.
Thank you, Grace. And yeah, it is a real honour to have Leon here. I just wanted to set the scene a little bit as to why this conversation feels really important in relation to space and the Black imagination. We at MAIA are an organisation that are trying to build infrastructure and demonstrate as they're exploring that relationship between imagination and liberation. And of course, there is no liberation without a climate justice practice that is central to that. And so this conversation about reparations is really like, what is it to repair? How do we think about the practice of care in the infrastructures that we build, in the systems that we design, in the relationships that we hold? And through all of that, there is constant struggle. But I remember I was listening to a talk that Leon was giving with our Civic Square friends some months ago, a year ago, I don't even know, what is time, some months ago. And I feel like it was one of the first times that I'd heard a critical conversation about reparations, particularly in reference to the Caribbean. And because a lot of the demonstrators that we're trying to build have come from that Caribbean typology of space, the yard, the household, the living room, the front room as a space for political organising and conversation, I couldn't appreciate that conversation any better. So it felt really exciting to extend the invitation to you. And yeah, we're deeply honoured to have you. So on that note.
Thank you very much. I hope I can do justice to the great work that you folk are doing here, and I'll do my best. So yeah, the talk is entitled Toward Repair, Acknowledging Colonial Histories for Climate Justice Between the Caribbean and the UK. So what I used to kind of build a version of this talk as like a history or an exploration of climate justice in the Caribbean. But I guess one of the things that I want to flag straight away is that you can't understand the very existence of the Caribbean without also making reference to the UK as the kind of, and particularly England and Great Britain as well, as the kind of territory that sort of helped to birth the Caribbean in its modern shape. And I'm specifically talking about modernity here and the role of colonialism and imperialism in kind of reformulating the Caribbean, or even creating the Caribbean from what was a series of islands where people lived to the entity that we understand as the Caribbean. So that's just something. So I've shifted the focus slightly to say it's between the Caribbean and the UK, and I want you to think about both of those territories and about the relationship between the two as I continue the talk. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting me as well. The outline, let's see if this is working. Yeah, the outline for the discussion is firstly to look at the case of climate injustice. So I'm sure many people who are sort of sitting here or watching this know or are aware of the fact that the Caribbean is disproportionately exposed to the impacts of climate breakdown. It's not the only place in the world that's disproportionately impacted or disproportionately threatened. There are lots of other analogous territories like the Pacific Islands with whom Caribbean peoples have long been in solidarity and collective struggle, like parts of Asia, like parts of Africa. There was mass flooding in Rwanda very recently, and that's on top of a drought. So what I'm saying in relation to the Caribbean also applies in similar or related ways, thank you to our geese friends, for applauding us.
Yeah, I was like, yeah.
The geese know, they know. They fly home.
know this.
They fly home in the winter for the warmer climate, so they know. So yeah, I'm talking about the Caribbean, but a lot of what I'm saying here applies to lots of other parts of the world as well. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of the relationship between justice and repair, and the extent to which it's possible to think about achieving justice if we don't also think about forms of repair. And yeah, I use repair rather than reparations, just I guess to try and point to a more expansive idea about what repair might mean and how justice can be enacted than sometimes gets captured within some accounts of reparations. That's not all accounts by any means. And then I'm going to point to some examples in the climate space around how we see instances of responses to climate breakdown that are more and less just. And there's the example of fair shares, which I'll talk about as being a move towards a more just response to the climate crisis, and recognizing histories of colonialism and the requirement to make sure that reparative justice is part of our response to climate breakdown. But to start with, I guess it's kind of the question of, well, why the Caribbean? Why are we thinking about the impact of climate breakdown in relation to the Caribbean? This slogan, 1.5 to survive, or barely survive, or 1.5 to stay alive, emerged partly out of the Caribbean. It emerged with the Association of Small Island States, which includes the Pacific Island states that I mentioned before, and also includes parts of Central and Southern Africa and parts of Asia. And it was a slogan that was coined as a kind of political tool to try and pressure negotiators in the formal climate change talks as part of the UN to get them to recognize the fact that any amount of global warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius would spell disaster and catastrophe for peoples in the regions where I mentioned. And so if we think about the impacts of climate breakdown in the Caribbean, we're already seeing we're about 1.3 degrees on average now, global warming. And we're already seeing significant economic hardship related to drought, related to rising sea levels, related to environmental degradation and coastal degradation, relating to more intense hurricanes and tropical storms, and the warming of the oceans, which is contributing to, and the acidification of the oceans, which is contributing to bleaching of coral reefs and other aquatic life. So that's where the slogan 1.5 to stay alive came from. Then the question is, why is the Caribbean disproportionately vulnerable? And like I said, a lot of what I'm going to say in relation to the Caribbean also applies to other parts of the world, but we're talking about the Caribbean here. Now, part of that vulnerability is to do with the kind of geographic or geophysical characteristics of the Caribbean, in the sense that that region already suffers from tropical storms. It's faced tropical storms throughout, as long as kind of records of such things began, and certainly as long as kind of folkloric memory goes back. However, the fact that tropical storms lead to vulnerability is itself a consequence of inequalities and the unequal distribution of resources. So you might have a tropical weather event where you see severe rainfall, and the fact that leads to landslide might be connected to the fact that riverbanks or hills have been deforested, and the fact that they've been deforested might be linked to the fact that people who live there needed to cut down the trees in order to find wood for their own reproduction, their own kind of living, or that the mahogany, for instance, in the case of Belize, was cut down by planters to be exported to make, fancy furniture in Europe, or the fact that a tropical storm impacts people who live in corrugated iron houses with, tin roofs. The fact that they get impacted by extreme winds is to do with the fact that they don't have the resources to build concrete shelters, for instance. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with impacts of climate change that have hit places like Haiti, Dominica, the Bahamas, Barbuda. There have been lots of hurricanes that have impacted these island states. And there's been recent research that has shown that as climate breakdown is unfolding, yes, indeed, hurricanes are becoming more intense. So it's to do with, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not going to pretend that I am, but my understanding of the climate sciences is to do with warming ocean temperatures contributing to greater pressure, so that when a storm comes in from the sea and makes landfall, there's kind of more energy in the storm system that it's collected partly from the energy, the heat that occupies the ocean. And this is a phenomenon that's only going to get worse as the ocean temperature rises, as the global warming temperature goes above or approaches 1.5 degrees and beyond. So you might be familiar with these names, which sound like relatively friendly, right? Sandy, Matthew, these are people you might go for a cup of tea with, or have some food. Yeah, Irma, Auntie Irma, Auntie Maria, Cousin Dorian. They're not, unfortunately, as kind of cuddly and friendly as the names might suggest. And they are, in fact, the names of kind of deadly hurricanes. And there's a whole side note about how hurricanes get their names and the role of kind of naming and so on, but I won't go into that here. But it's an interesting feature that, yeah, this is how we come to know the weather patterns that currently wreak such destruction. And the destruction is such to the extent that a scholar writing in 2016 suggested that we're likely to see hurricane damages increase in the Caribbean between 22 and 77% by the end of the century. And that's if we continue as we are doing with a high level of greenhouse gas emissions, so high concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, and if that leads to this higher level of warming above 1.5 degrees that I mentioned. I just want to, so yeah, the first point just to note is that the harms of climate breakdown are unevenly distributed. Some people are much more exposed than others. If you live in the Caribbean, you're generally going to be more exposed to the impacts of climate breakdown earlier than if you live in the UK, for instance. But it gets deeper than that, as I'm sure you're all aware as well, which is that if you're living in the Caribbean, your vulnerability is partly going to depend to your position within society, your relationship to or your access to money and resources. So we can take a concrete example to sort of to tease this out a bit further. So let's look at Richard Branson here playing Perudo, which is a great dice game. I've got nothing against Perudo. Sipping wine. Again, I don't have anything against wine per se. In his wine cellar, in his hurricane shelter ahead of Hurricane Irma, striking the British Virgin Islands. Meanwhile, this is an image of the aftermath of that very same hurricane in the very same territory, a bit in a different, I think it's a different island or a different part of the island, where you can see that most people's shelter. So what you're seeing there is an image of lots of places where once buildings stood, where once there were gardens, where once there were trees, that where now all of those things no longer exist. So Richard Branson's house did stay standing. I think he suffered some damage, although he's a billionaire, so I think he was able to cover it without worrying too much. But his wine cellar was totally unaffected. Everyone in his wine cellar, his close family and his friends were all safe and well, which was definitely not the case for a vast majority of British Virgin Islanders, Bermudans, Antiguans, and so on, people who were living in the Caribbean around the time that Hurricane Irma struck, people who had to leave their homes, try and find storm shelters where they existed, and often they wouldn't be available, or they might be full, or had to travel to neighboring islands to try and get out of the path of the storm. So the point, yeah, is just that it's not, this vulnerability that the Caribbean faces isn't a natural phenomenon, right? It's produced by how we've organized our societies. It's produced by the inequalities that we allow to persist and indeed that are encouraged by people like Richard Branson. Back to this kind of 1.5 degree target. So if we agree that the impacts of climate breakdown are going to be devastating for the Caribbean region, and if we agree that it's reasonable to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. What hopes are we seeing to try and achieve that in terms of action required by governments and by businesses and others? Unfortunately, the news isn't great. This report came out in October 2022, just around the time of the last climate change negotiations. And it was an analysis of the commitments that different governments had made towards reducing their greenhouse gas emissions being the kind of directly implicated in the cause of climate breakdown. It's a long chunk of text. I'll just highlight a couple of points. One thing that they said in their analysis was that the commitments, the pledges that have been made by governments would actually make a negligible difference to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. But worse than that, they said that the policies that are currently in place, so if we go along with what governments are currently committing to, we're likely to see rises of 2.8 degrees or 2.4 to 2.6 by the end of the century. I know that sounds small, right? The difference between 1.5 degrees and 2.8, and in terms of like, not really. I mean, to me, to an extent it does, maybe it doesn't. Let's talk about that. But it's double. And as you know from the earlier slides, that's like a whole kind of degree above the limit that people have said is a level to survive. So unfortunately, we're not seeing the action that's required. And this led the report's authors to suggest that only an urgent and system-wide transformation can deliver the cuts needed. Interestingly, in their report, I mean, this is a UN report, so it's a fairly mainstream intergovernmental organization or international governmental body. They didn't really talk about the kinds of system-wide transformation that I personally would envisage in response to this. They talked about things like a rapid decarbonization of energy infrastructure, so moving things towards greener energy, which sure, yeah, that's probably going to be part of the picture, but it's not, I don't think, the kind of system-wide transformation that's going to make people less vulnerable and going to make societies more equal. Just the other week, a new report came out that suggested that we're likely to exceed 1.5 degrees within 5 years, partly to do with an El Nino weather event, which will amplify the already existing warming. So I mentioned that we're at about 1.3 degrees now of warming. So we're about, here. We're already above 1.1 degree of warming, and we're likely to hit this range between, well, they kind of say that there's a 66% chance that temperatures could go above 1.5 in the next 5 years. So the picture isn't particularly rosy, and all of that leads Caribbean peoples, representatives, scholars, and others to say that climate change represents an urgent and potentially irreversible threat to Caribbean societies, not just to, the kind of current way of living. It's a threat to the existence of the Caribbean as we currently understand it. So as we think about that, I want you to bear in mind the question of whose lives matter and whose lives are deemed as exposable, dispensable, whose lives does the system currently function to protect and enable, and whose lives are potentially, exposed or at risk of disappearing. I should also say, if people have I might use jargon and things like that, so please do stop me if you have any questions or if anything is not clear.
What does negligible mean?
Negligible. Anyone help me out? Like less, like not very significant. Yeah.
Crowdsource definitions.
That's it. Yeah. I say ask me questions, but then I'm just going to get help anyway. So, and in response to that, another thing that's been pointed out, this comes from Dr. Ulrich Trotz, who's a climatologist based in Belize, who has studied climate change and has looked at the impacts. He said, look, we know what we need to do. We know how to build resilience in the Caribbean, but we just do not have the resources. And this is the question I want to delve into a bit further as we think about repair and reparations and about inequity and injustice. And indeed, a Caribbean politician, Sean Edwards, said that it is an injustice that small island nations in the Caribbean have to seek aid or loans from more industrialized economies, many of whom emit most of the carbon that causes climate change. So there's this fundamental kind of injustice at the heart of the climate crisis, which is that, well, I'll say more about it in due course. So how might we understand this trajectory? Okay, nice, another definition in the chat there. Negligible, barely noticeable. How might we understand the futures that are facing people who live in the Caribbean and, like I said, in lots of parts of the world? Well, we have to look backwards. We have to look to the questions of history if we're going to understand the futures that are coming. And particularly, one aspect of history that's incredibly neglected that I want us to think about is the histories of empire. Because the problem with climate breakdown, and I think this gets to what you were saying at the start, Amara, about the spaces that you were in where you were hearing about climate and you were hearing about reparations, but they weren't being brought together. A problem about a lot of the climate spaces up until very recently, and even still very recently, this continues, is that people talk about climate breakdown without thinking about imperialism and colonialism, and without thinking about how those systems of oppression and extraction, exploitation have led to a world which is deeply racialized and in which people hold deeply racist views, and which means that some people's lives are made to matter more than others people's lives. So I think, yeah, that's something that needs to constantly be reiterated in the climate change conversation. It's absolutely crucial to our understanding of both why climate change is happening, who it's going to affect, and how we might do something about it that's not just going to reproduce the problems of the world that have given rise to the problem in the first place. And yeah, to use a couple more pieces of jargon, I would say that the governance of climate change is depoliticized and ahistorical. So by that, I mean that depoliticized, often we talk about climate change in terms of like, I've already done it today, in terms of like degrees Celsius of warming, or meters of sea level rise, or billions of dollars worth of costs. Those things are all true or relevant. However, they don't allow us to, they're not the language in which we talk about values and ethics and justice and politics. We need to also think about care and harm and justice. So we need to go beyond just a very technical language that is thinking about measuring how much we measure the impacts in terms of money, or in terms of parts per million of molecules of carbon in the atmosphere, or in terms of degrees of warming. We need to have a language that's political, a language that brings in politics and ethics. And in terms of them being ahistorical, essentially, a lot of the discussions, as I've said, don't really understand the role of imperialist and colonial projects in giving rise to climate breakdown. And that's what I want to say a bit more about now. This is really a long quote, but I think it's quite a useful one from a scholar based in the US, but she's from Bangladesh originally. She says that what we're seeing is climate coloniality, and she kind of goes on to explain what this is, but I'll read the quote out. She says, climate coloniality seeps through everyday life across space and time, weighing down and curtailing opportunities and possibilities through a toxic mix of global racisms, rapacious extractivism, colonial capital dispossessions, climate debts, patriarchy, and imperialism. So she's essentially pointing the finger of the impacts of a climate breakdown at a system of coloniality, and that's what she describes in terms of it being based on racisms, extraction, dispossession, debt, patriarchy, and imperialism. She goes on, she says, dominant discussions around climate change make it seem apolitical. Sure, yeah, I can do that. I mean, I think it will come up. If it's this quote, it will come up at the end of the slide. Her name's Farhana Sultana.
Great name.
Yeah. So she says, these dominant discussions are apolitical, and she talks about what I've just talked about we think about them in terms of how do we fix them with technology? How much carbon do we need to remove from the atmosphere? How much money do we need to throw at the problem? And that removes the politics from it. It removes the values, the ethics,
so
the
colonial.
Well, exactly.
Like, what can we measure?
Exactly. It's about measurement and documentation and
our advancements, like technological advancements.
And she says instead, it should be seen as a restructuring of relationships to ecologies, waters, lands, and communities that we are intimately, materially, and politically connected to. So, this is a question of relations. I'm a sociologist by training, and we're taught to think in terms of social relations, how everybody in a society is related to each other through, thousands, millions of invisible bonds. We're in relationships of interdependence, codependence, and also sometimes conflict and hostility, as in the case of the cause of climate breakdown. But this is from Sultana 2022. I can put together like a bibliography, and I can, what I should also do is actually just take I'm pretending this is a joke for the purpose of the recording. I'll take the articles and share them as well, because you might not be able to access them by university libraries. So I won't do that, but I will do that. It's not piracy.
Someone will do it.
Someone will do it. Someone may do that. Someone may have already done it, and I'll just share what they've already done. So yeah, what has the role of colonialism been in shaping the modern world and shaping how that modern world is being affected by climate breakdown? This is a map, that I often go back to. It shows parts of the world that have been under some kind of European control, whether that's direct influence, whether that's direct colonization, whether that's kind of indirect influence. Essentially, almost everywhere outside of Europe has been under some kind of European influence or control at some point in recent history. And the sociologist Satnam Virdi, he says, well, how that system was allowed to function was that ideas of racial difference, inferiority, and superiority allowed colonizers, Western European colonizers, to perpetrate violence, genocide, and colonial expansion. So in the Caribbean, you had the kind of massacre of. So my dad's from St. Kitts and Nevis, and you go there. There's a river. I think it's called Blood River. I can't remember. But anyway, it's a creek where the river was said to run red with blood after a massacre of the people who'd lived there by predominantly British, but also French and Spanish colonizers in the 16th and 17th centuries. So they were able to do that partly because of their mindset, their value system, the way of viewing the world was one in which these people were inferior, they were backwards, they needed civilizing, they weren't worthy of life, their lives didn't matter. And in the case of climate breakdown, that map that I showed you maps onto inequalities in carbon emissions. So carbon emissions are what contribute to climate breakdown. Greenhouse gases in general are what contribute. And this is from a report that came out a couple of weeks ago, I think. And it's a report that analyzes reparations. I'll say a bit more about it. And this report, the authors have made sure that it's open access, so you can access it without having to go behind a paywall. But anyway, I'll collate the things together and then find a way that we can share them with everyone for further reading and so on. But yeah, they point out they did some analysis, and they found out that the global north, so parts of the world, Europe and North America, Australia, the richer part of the world, have exceeded their fair share of the planet's capacity to absorb greenhouse gases by 92%. And yet the early impacts of climate breakdown, the impacts that are projected to occur, disproportionately fall on the global south, which is responsible for only about 8% of emissions, 8% of the causes of climate breakdown. So Asia, Africa, Latin America. And this is represented in this really distorted looking map, which shows people who are at risk of climate breakdown in parts of the world where people are left homeless, displaced, or requiring emergency assistance in a typical year. So you can see it's almost like a bit of an inverse of the other map, although if we add to the other map North America and Australia and the other kind of settler colonies, then this map of emissions makes more sense. Those countries are less vulnerable, less at harm. And then, this is the map of pollution. So it shows countries that are darker have higher per capita emissions, so that's higher carbon emissions per person. And the bigger countries are the countries with a bigger share of global GDP, so global kind of economic activity. So they're the richer countries essentially. These maps are both available from a great resource called Carbon Map, which again I'll make sure it's there in the resources to accompany the talk. And you can drill down into that. So it's not just about countries, obviously, right? Like not everyone in the UK is equally responsible for emissions. And indeed, the authors of the report point out that it's the richest 1% of the world's population who've contributed to 15% of emissions. And that's just between 1990 and 2015. And that's more than twice as much as the poorest 50% who contributed just 7% of emissions. And they're the ones, and yet the poorer people are the ones who suffer the brunt of harms. So to show you that visually, This is from a different analysis, but it's a similar kind of presentation, which shows that if you're a top 1% earner, then your kind of share of global carbon emissions is likely to be significantly higher, kind of 80 times higher than those who are in the bottom 50%. And there's more reading on this, other reports which have kind of looked at the lifestyles of the extremely rich, so people who kind of fly all over the place on private jets, and who kind of, I don't know, any of you watch Succession? I'm a big fan of Succession. But like, yeah.
So you can finish the question.
I've got so much to say. I love series.
Okay, yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it's going to hot up, but that's a different talk. But the point is that the lifestyles, so Succession depicts this extremely wealthy, like kind of like Rupert Murdoch type family. And they're all, every episode's in a different location, whether it's a yacht in Cannes, whether it's a ski resort in Aspen, whether it's, but essentially they're just, you just see the extent to which their lifestyle relies on a kind of access to wealth and resources that's unimaginable for the vast majority of the Earth's population, but also contributes to climate breakdown in a way that's vastly disproportionate.
Well, just when they take 2 jets when they could all fit in one.
Yeah, I mean,
Going that one.
yeah, no.
So they're like, are you going with that?
Yeah.
All right.
So yeah, as I mentioned, this report, this analysis, they basically have used those calculations. They've done a series of analyses to say, okay, well, who's responsible? And obviously, to some extent, it's individuals, and to some extent, it's governments, you know, such as the British state when it had the East India Company going about under its name, or what have you. But their analysis focuses particularly on the companies themselves that are benefiting from the extraction, exploration, production, refining of oil and gas and coal, which are the main culprits in causing climate breakdown. When we think about why these companies might be disproportionately responsible, the picture gets a bit more galling, a bit worse, because these companies knew about the impacts of their economic activity. So they were getting extremely wealthy from, you know, extracting oil from the ground, digging coal from mines, you know, piping gas out of the earth. They knew about all of this, and yet at the time they kind of kept quiet, or they suppressed the information. So they lied to their shareholders. They funded, you know, millions and probably billions of PR and kind of brand washing that would allow them to continue this activity, because it was incredibly profitable. So I think it's reasonable to suggest that they have a responsibility to contribute to the cost of the impacts of climate breakdown. And that's a mild way of putting it. We can be more direct if we want. More generally, I think calls for repair are growing louder, and I feel like it's a conversation that is gaining more attention. Ideas of reparative justice, ideas of reparations. On the left of the screen is a book written by I don't want to use his title, but yeah, it's technically Sir Hilary Beckles. Hilary Beckles, who's a brilliant historian from the Caribbean, scholar of colonialism and imperialism, but he wrote a book which analysed the debt that Britain would owe to the Caribbean based on the fact that it was engaged in slavery and genocide of indigenous peoples in the Caribbean. And I want to bring you back to that quote that I shared earlier, where Dr. Trott said, we don't have the resources. We know what we need to do to build our resilience, but we just don't have the resources. And as you can see from this image, so the image in the middle is a sugarcane plantation in Antigua, I believe. And the image on the right is a factory in Manchester, a textile mill. And what we know is that the resources, so this activity of harvesting sugarcane was incredibly profitable. There were a lot of resources generated from it. But why don't people in the Caribbean have the resources now that they need to, you know, respond to the impacts of climate breakdown? Well, that's because those resources, to a large extent, were siphoned off into the factories and mill towns and industrial centres, such as Birmingham, such as probably the industrial estate, you know, over there that's being kind of remade. So there's this direct relationship between the fact that the countries don't have the resources that they need, and the fact that Britain, for instance, among many other places, has a far in excess of what it needs for its own kind of survival. And not only that, but the fact that this economic activity, the Industrial Revolution itself, is at fault for causing climate breakdown. That's what kick-started the emissions and the vast exploitation of coal. It was a coal-based steam engine that was used to kind of mechanize production and kickstart the Industrial Revolution. And again, Birmingham has a particular place in that story. Elsewhere, CARICOM, the Caribbean community, have put forward this 10-point plan for reparations for slavery for African people. I would say it's somewhat limited, but it's still more than nothing. But they've kind of, they say there's like a 10-step process that they need to follow. I mean, I think hopefully we can get into this in the questions and answers, but I think their approach is based on the idea that they're genuinely trying to pursue a legal case against Britain, against other countries. And so they're keeping it very, what they would say is very tight in terms of what they're asking for. But I would argue it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't address some of the root causes of the problem. Meanwhile, some of you might be familiar with the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown. He was speaking at the UN, and he was kind of making the case that the storms that hit Barbuda in particularly really badly were a consequence of climate change. And he said, look, we know that it's industrialized countries, the ones who are benefiting from the fossil fuels, they're the ones who make the profits, whilst in the Caribbean we're suffering the consequences. So he brings in this language of justice into that space and tries to emphasize that it's a question not just of amount of damages, but it's all a question of inequality and justice. And he goes on to say that the problem in the Caribbean is that the islands are generally small with limited resources. So we're being told by the international community to build a more resilient infrastructure, but we don't have the money, we don't have the resources. And that's because of industrialized countries who have to take responsibility for their actions. I mean, I agree with everything he said there. However, it's also worth bearing in mind that he's not entirely on the domestic scene. He's implicated in some dodgy stuff.
On the domestic scene.
And this is itself linked to kind of the infrastructures that were put in place by colonial elites when they kind of granted or allowed decolonization, or when decolonization was fought for. They made sure that the governance structures were very much in the image of the colonizer countries, and they don't serve the peoples of those territories. So just one example is in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma. Prime Minister Brown was involved with the Hollywood actor Robert De Niro of basically just privatizing a lot of the communal land, the land that was held in common for like over a century. They used the kind of extreme situation, the crisis point of the hurricane, for which people had to be moved off Barbuda, so they weren't there to kind of defend and protest. They used that as an opportunity to kind of push through a land grab, which they could then use for luxury condos that are funded by like investors like De Niro. So yeah, I guess we can be critical in our support for the demands of people like Gaston Brown in the international sphere. And we might ask how far his notion of reparative justice goes. Does it really, does it go far enough? Does it actually?
Does it go anywhere?
Okay, yeah, or we can be more cynical. Meanwhile, the US have taken a line for a long time where they've said they're not going to pay into climate funds. They're not going to pay into reparations. They say, like, they have this really weird expression. They say, we recognize our historic role. Okay, great, if you do that. But then they go on to say immediately, but there's no sense of guilt or culpability or reparations. They just reject that. This is a quote from about a decade or so ago, just around the Copenhagen climate change talks, but the sentiment remains the same. They're not going to voluntarily, enact any kind of repair or I mean, there has been a change at the last climate change talks where loss and damage, which could be the mechanism through which some relatively small form of reparative justice might be achieved, that has been formally acknowledged in the process. But whether or not, given the extent to which governments have committed to things and then not actually follow through, whether or not we can put any hope in that is, an open question.
How would they understand the difference? Like, how would the US argue that what's that line for them?
Yeah, like why? Why not?
Like, we would do this, we won't do that. What's the...
I mean, I think they make all kinds of moves, such as saying, well, you got to look at China. That's kind of a big one. That yes, we had a role historically, but we're not going to do anything unless China does anything. And they know that even though China's only more recently industrialized, they know that, I mean, China is in lots of ways doing more than the US, but they know that they're not going to get the response where China's like, okay, yeah, we'll do it as well. And then they're going to have to commit. And I think I think they don't have to address that contradiction as well. They don't, I think they just live with it. They just let it hang because they are an imperial power. They are the dominant power.
Yeah. A climate fund would be something that wouldn't necessarily go to like the global south.
Well, it might, and I'll say a bit about the kinds of action that take place. But they have they're not going to do anything that undermines capitalism, because that's the economic system that they rely on, and has made lots of people in the US very rich and powerful. But it's an interesting question. Let's come back to it, because I think I'll speak a bit to it in terms of what does climate finance actually go towards. Meanwhile, our own government has kind of constantly ruled out the idea of reparations. So this is when David Cameron was in Jamaica to build a prison ship.
Yeah. Great day.
So does anyone know why he was there to build a prison ship? Not a prison ship, sorry, a prison.
Didn't he want to send back people that he wanted to deport?
Exactly, yeah. So it was the UK, because of human rights legislation, the UK wasn't being allowed to deport people to Jamaica. I mean, they say back to Jamaica, but these were often, if you're familiar with the work of scholar Luke De Nerone, he's worked with people who have been deported and also people here in the UK, but a lot of them, they grew up here or they came here when they were very young. In fact, the extent to which these people who were deported back to Jamaica were unfamiliar with Jamaica is exemplified by the fact that the Home Office gave them guides on like how not to stand out as a tourist, how not to get robbed backyard. They were like, these people aren't Jamaican. We're going to give you some advice so that you can blend in, because otherwise you're going to stick out. And
gaslight.
So yeah, the UK government was prepared to spend money on building a prison so they could deport more people, because the conditions in prison in Jamaica were not very, like, they weren't up to the standards that the UK Human Rights Act would allow. But they ruled out reparations. More recently, Rishi Sunak said the same thing. So during the climate change talks last year, Rishi Sunak has ruled out reparations. And not only that, but we see, I mean, I'm sure many of you know the wider context around this so-called war on woke, and the fact that even this history, even the teaching of this history is being challenged in schools in the UK, in the US as well, where the UK takes its lead a lot of the time. But the idea of people learning about the fact, any of the contestations of history, learning about the harms of the British Empire, that in itself is under attack. So you can't even talk about it, let alone begin to pay any kind of reparations or move towards reparative justice.
Can I ask, is their view that like, oh, we should all put like 10 quid in, all the countries should put 10 quid, or are they saying that we should put in more, but I won't do that unless other countries do that?
You mean like the US or
British? But is it more like they want, if they see it as like, oh, it's equitable if everybody puts the same amount of money in, but they don't acknowledge that they have significantly large amount of wealth and responsibility?
I mean, I think that's a really good question as well. I can't get into the headspace of those people. For me, it's a contradiction. But I think, so in terms of what they would say, they say different things at different times. they often say, like, they'll often express regret, but they'll never apologize because they don't want to open themselves up to legal claims of responsibility. So I think there's just a pragmatic acknowledgement. If they recognize these claims for reparative justice, then, or for even reparations in a more limited way, then that's going to cost. And, you know, that's not part of their political, they're not prepared to spend money on that. Sometimes they'll say things like that, like they'll say, yeah, the US will say, we're not going to do anything unless India and China, who are also now more wealthy than they were, unless they also do something because they're also emitting emissions. So there's a range of different responses. I mean, it just seems like straight up kind of politics, you know, just denying what you can see with your own eyes.
Yeah, it's definitely like politics. And I think like above anything, it's like the audacity. Like it's just simply some people just are like audacious enough to do something and just deny it. And you see every day in British politics. I can't. Oh gosh, of course, I can't think of an example like
Boris Johnson yesterday with his latest lockdown, breaking parties.
Yeah. Like there was the parties, or like the whole. It was the health secretary going around in Parliament doing God knows what. God knows. Yeah, and it's like we saw all of it, and like there was even like camera footage of the parties and all the other scandals, but they're like, yeah, but did you really see it? But,
Which, I mean, I think that gets to an important point, which is it's about power. You can do that if you hold a position of significant material, financial, political power. If I do that, like if I, you know, do something, I don't know what, but like I get caught and then I say, no, but it wasn't me. I mean, that's not going to go anywhere, right? Like I don't hold the power. Maybe I hold more power than, say, an unhoused person, where if they get accused of shoplifting, but if I get accused, maybe, you know, I'm articulate, I'm educated, I can like present a version of myself and maybe I can talk my way out of it. But compared to like a politician or a state, you know, especially the state like the US, which is militarily so superior, like you can't force them to do anything. You can appeal to the morality, but they can just sort of sidestep it. They don't even have to engage, you know.
Morality. But we kind of need them to engage. So we're knowing that we're in a place where everyone's in denial. Like, where do we go from here? Then knowing that we need their engagement. Like, is there?
Do we need their engagement?
I'll wait. Like,
Everyone's like, yeah, but I'm waiting for it to end.
We don't know what other slides Leon has.
They will come back to questions.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good points, and I'd like us to have that conversation. Yeah, I mean, just to take one example, Jamaica. So like Jamaica has repaid over 40 years, $19 billion, and it still owes 7.8 billion just on interest, and it was only lent 18 billion. So it's paid back its loan over $1 billion more than it borrowed, and it's still paying huge interest. So there's this, I mean, it's just further evidence, I think. And yet the politicians are wanting to build prison ships for people who are moving, and there's going to be more movement in relation to climate breakdown because people are not going to be able to stay where they are. And the response, as we all know, is really, really harmful. So I just got distracted by the bedroom that appeared. Oh no, I thought that was the webcam of like one of your bedrooms upstairs, but it's inside of the bedroom. You guys are talking about the health secretary and. All right, so I hope I've presented a picture of what climate breakdown means for the Caribbean, why we have to think about the histories of colonialism and imperialism in relation to that. But I also want to think about more or less fair, more or less just solutions and responses. The formal kind of response to climate breakdown takes place with the United Nations under the United Nations Convention on Climate Change Conference of Parties, the UNFCCC. So this was formed in 1992 at the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit. And this gave rise to the Kyoto Protocol, Kyoto Protocol, which was an agreement that governments made that they would try and reduce emissions. That was what they said. It was going to expire around the time of the COP15 in Copenhagen, and I want to say a little bit about what went down in Copenhagen because it was it's quite illustrative of how limited these formal decision-making structures and bodies are. Essentially, there was no agreement made in Copenhagen to renew Kyoto or to replace it. It took like another 5-6 years until the COP21 in Paris to actually agree a successor agreement where government said, okay, yeah, we'll update our pledges, we'll commit to more emissions cuts. And in the meantime, all that had happened was more extreme weather events had taken place, more evidence of the impacts of climate breakdown had become available, more of the injustices of it had been exposed. Meanwhile, action wasn't really taken, which is why that initial report that I shared with you said, we need a system-wide transformation. And then, yeah, just last year we had the COP27 in Egypt. So this is the kind of formal stage on which climate politics takes place. This is kind of government responses, international government responses. But they've received a poor report card. They've been given an F for fail, or maybe a U for ungraded. They haven't achieved what they are supposed to achieve. They haven't achieved emission cuts, and worse than that, they actually threaten the lives of poorer people by committing them to the current trajectory we're on. Going back to the Copenhagen talks that I mentioned, which took place in 2009, you had a negotiator there who was from Sudan, and he kind of criticized the deal that was being put forward. And it wasn't just being put forward, it was like countries were being demanded to sign this so-called deal. But he said, actually, this deal is like a suicide pact. It's gonna maintain the economic dependence of the many on the few. It's the same logic as kind of, funnel people into furnaces in Europe. It's a very harmful and entirely inappropriate deal. We're not going to sign it. But in response to that, you had the US, Britain, France, Germany, and others kind of saying, okay, well, to get you to sign it, to get you to commit, we'll pledge $100 billion worth of climate financing. So this goes back to your question about the kind of role of funding and aid. I mean, on one level, it might seem like a useful thing to have climate financing committed, but in practice, what we hear from the Caribbean, for instance, is that the amount of financing that's actually being delivered is far short of what's required. And not only that, it's not actually being dispersed to people. It's not reaching where it needs to go. And worse than that, the countries who are pledging climate finance are giving way less than their share of historical emissions. So this shows the US at the very top of the chart in terms of how much of a share of its, how much money they should be giving if we base their contribution on how much they've contributed to causing carbon emissions. And the UK isn't far off the top spot there as well. Meanwhile, those countries who refused to sign the deal, the one that Lumumba Diapping said was like a suicide pact, they were spied on. The US government under Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, they basically instructed their diplomats to find dirt on politicians. So they spied on the Ethiopian politician, they spied on various other politicians and tried to get information and data that would allow them to blackmail those people so that they could force them to sign up to the accord. And where that didn't work, they then tried to bribe them. So they said, look, that aid that we promised you in relation to the drought that you're suffering, you're not going to get that unless you actually sign up to this climate change deal that we've put together, because we need a good news story. We need an agreement. So this is kind of how the mechanics of power work at this scale, where you have a superpower like the US, an imperial power like the US, with an agenda, and you have dissenting countries a lot of them were led by President Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales of Bolivia. There was a kind of counter summit that was created, and lots of small, more kind of marginalized states attended that, but it didn't have any power. It didn't have any, you know, didn't have the wealth and power of countries like the US. And we wouldn't know any of this if it weren't for the cables that were leaked by WikiLeaks. So yeah, this is just one example of the news stories that were broken by that leak. So this isn't stuff that they were openly admitting or acknowledging. It was something we found out later about how they were practicing. And worse than that as well, in terms of the kind of climate finance that becomes available, Caribbean practitioners and politicians have said, look, they make us jump through hoops. To access the money, we require certain, it requires often I mean, look, how many people here have been involved in a grant writing process where you've had to bid for funding, you've had to talk about how you're going to document what you're doing? That requires certain skills. It requires sometimes it requires an infrastructure. You know, you might need an accountant to be able to document things. A lot of small island states don't have the infrastructure to access this funding. And when you're talking about billions of dollars, the level of kind of scrutiny and oversight that's demanded by the donor countries is very high. And not only that, but where often this money isn't even a donation in inverted commas, it's a loan. So you have the problems, as I mentioned, with Jamaica still not having paid back its debt from a loan under structural adjustment in the 1980s. And that's the same for many countries around the world. But also, they might take the money now, but in the long term, they'll still have to pay someone back. And a colleague of mine, Keston Perry, who's also a scholar of reparations and reparative justice in relation to climate, he did an analysis of Haiti and the distribution of climate aid within Haiti, and he wrote this article, which we're running short on time, so I won't go into lots of detail, but essentially what he said was that a lot of the money that was being given by donor institutions such as the World Bank is about decarbonizing Haiti's electricity grid. So removing the pollution that might be associated with producing energy in Haiti. But he pointed out that actually just 20% of Haitians have access to electricity anyway. And yet, if you have a disaster, as you often will do in the Caribbean, because we know that hurricanes are becoming more intense and they existed prior to climate breakdown anyway, you're going to need power, you're going to need access to electricity. And yet most of Haitians don't have that. And he says, look, the money that's being used here to decarbonize, which is already a very low carbon economy, could be used to provide access to energy more widely, could be used to build up the grid and the infrastructure. He also says, you know, we could see reforestation as an alternative kind of like climate change fighting measure. Haiti is the Caribbean's most deforested nation, and this contributes to flooding, coastal erosion, and water pollution. And yet, this isn't something that's prioritized by donors. So often, the money that is given is highly conditional. It has to tick the boxes of the donor. So if the donor thinks, you know, oh well, we want to decarbonize, that's the thing that matters here in Europe, that must be what matters in the Caribbean, then Haitians don't have that much autonomy, if any, to kind of say, no, what we need is access to electricity, let alone decarbonizing electricity, given that we've barely had access to it for the past, you know, however many years. And we can compare responses to climate breakdown in the Netherlands, which, you know, was once a colonizer country, still has colonial territories in the Caribbean, St. Martin, for instance, Aruba as well. They have billions that they spend on flood defenses every year. They spend billions of euros. And yet in the Caribbean, the story is, as we talked about earlier, that the resources are not there. People know what needs to happen. They know how to build flood defenses. That knowledge and that technology and experience is there. It's just predominantly the lack of resources are there. And yeah, this quote speaks to a fact which is maybe even more profound than the idea of redistributing money. It's that if you're going to continue to pollute, if you're going to still emit emissions, and you're going to go over 4 degrees of warming, or up to 4 degrees, which is what some of the projections state, then there's no amount of money that you can give to the Maldives or an island in the Bahamas or anywhere if those islands themselves are going to disappear, if the threat to Caribbean societies is existential. So what about an alternative kind of area for our attention and alternative set of actions. One proposal that's common among like climate movements and other places is this idea of divestment. So pulling money out of fossil fuel companies. Figures like Bill Gates, billionaire philanthropist, will say that that is not something people should be aiming for. It will have little impact, although the evidence is very different. The evidence suggests that divesting from fossil fuels has a significant impact. And actually, if you get, for instance, pension funds, a lot of people's pension funds, or local authorities who hold a lot of our money, tax money, and they will invest it in stocks. If you force these people to remove those stocks from polluting industries and polluting companies, then actually it will lead to, or it can contribute to sort of putting pressure on those companies. It will affect their bottom line. And this is a story that came out from a couple of weeks ago, which showed that the value of these companies, those companies that are mentioned earlier in terms of being disproportionately responsible for climate breakdown, their value has gone down in response to, for instance, law cases brought by representatives of people in the global south or representatives of future generations, because it does impact their ability to make profit, because it threatens their business model ultimately. Briefly, I wanted to say, because often we're told about green transitions, we're told that all we need to do is swap out carbon for a more sustainable energy force, such as green energy or solar energy, which I wouldn't inherently disagree with. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but we have to be careful to look at the broader questions of social organization, how it is that, who's making the decisions in society, who holds power, who has access to the wealth and resources that are going to be either, the goods that are going to be produced by greener energy, or the infrastructure that's going to be providing that greener energy. Because often, and this is an analysis from War on Want and the London Mining Network, they found out that a lot of this decarbonization, this so-called green transition from a carbon economy to a post-carbon economy, rests upon the same kinds of extractive, exploitative, harmful practices that have dominated under colonialism and imperialism, whereby precious metals are extracted from communities that are vulnerable or marginalized, and their access, their rights, their indigenous land rights are denied. And in this way, it can reproduce inequalities, and actually it can increase the demand for the materials that are being mined. So you might limit the production of carbon, but perhaps you vastly increase the production, extraction of lithium, and then that has all kinds of other negative impacts in terms of who gets to benefit from that, who's fronting the cost, who's exposed to the pollution that's left behind. So yeah, we want to be slightly skeptical of those ideas. And besides, figures such as newly outed fascist Elon Musk, in response to a tweet which he seems to love, responding to his Twitter mentions anyway, he was kind of talking about, so somebody got in touch with him on Twitter and said, look, when the US government organized a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia so that they could secure the supply of or access to lithium, that wasn't in the interest of people, because here Elon Musk is talking about what the interests of the people, and Elon Musk just replies, we'll coup who we want, deal with it, which again is just that like brazen expression of power and military might that you can only really occupy if you're an imperial power. So what's an alternative? What's a fairer set of responses? How might we think about repair and justice in a more expansive way, in a more inclusive way, in a more like long-term sustainable way, a way that doesn't jeopardize the conditions for life on Earth, and that doesn't reinforce highly colonial and extractive relationships? One concept that I work with is climate justice. It's not entirely without its problems, but I think it's a really useful one for thinking about climate change. And climate justice requires us to acknowledge this political the political facts associated with climate change. So where I talked about it being depoliticized, climate justice is very much about saying, no, climate change is a political issue. It's about who holds power. It's about who gets to make decisions about how the world is organized, about who gets to make decisions about how we respond to the climate breakdown. And so it's an ethical issue. It's an issue of society and how we, the extent to which we might be able to imagine a world beyond the one today, the one that we know today. So how much might we actually be able to see radical transformation? And in terms of what climate justice might mean, practically speaking, we could go back to thinking about the overconsumption of resources by some people, some states, some companies. And this is a representation of kind of overconsumption of greenhouse gases. And we might think about the fact that we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees as demanded by small island states and others. And we might say, well, okay, if we're going to reduce emissions to 1.5 degrees and limit warming to that level, then the UK needs to play its fair share. So that means the UK needs to take into account its historical responsibility as being one of the highest emitters in history of greenhouse gases. It needs to take into account its financial capacity. So it's not going to, the vast majority of people in the UK aren't going to necessarily be hurt by a redistribution of wealth and resources. In fact, to some extent, in terms of redistributing power, they might gain, and I would think they would gain from a redistribution because they'd have more meaningful lives, they'd have more say over the work that they do, the decisions that affect them. Obviously, they're going to be a tiny slither of the population who are going to lose out massively, but they're the ones who are, taking their private jets
separately.
Separately. And then also, it rests on a kind of moral legal case. What might that mean in practice? Well, this calculation, which is provided by War on Want and other organizations who did this analysis, they basically said it would require the UK to reduce its emissions because of its kind of global historical emissions. It needs to reduce its emissions by 200% below 1990 levels by 2030. So obviously, I'm sure the more mathematically sharp in the room picked up, I mean, I didn't pick this up, I'm not mathematically sharp, but picked up that you can only reduce 100%, right? So how are you going to get to that second 100%? And that means that the UK has to support emissions reductions overseas. And again, they talk about ways in which that might take place. So domestically, it means decarbonizing the economy, although you have to do so in a way that, doesn't further reproduce inequalities of access to land and access to resources, but also internationally, it means supporting those countries who are on the front lines, and it means a form of climate reparations. Specifically, we can look at all of these factors, both domestically and internationally. So I'll just pick out a few. The people who have the most wealth take the greatest responsibility. People who are extremely high, who live like extremely high carbon consumption lifestyles, having to change those lifestyles. Internationally, it might mean making sure that those people in Haiti have access to energy. It might mean that we promote agroecological farming. It certainly means ending UK public money for public subsidies for fossil fuels extraction projects elsewhere, and contributing to rainforest tropical deforestation of rainforests, or deforestation of tropical rainforests. Anyway, sorry, it's been an hour, so I'm sure you're all flagging too. But just a couple more slides, just to say, well, how do we do that, or what might climate justice mean, like in the here and now for us? Because I often get asked that when I give different kind of talks, and I just think these are some things that come from the top of my head. I'm sure you all have loads of really good ideas as well, and I'd be curious to hear those. But for me, it's about boosting those divestment campaigns. So, holding your, whether it's the bank that you bank with, or whether it's the government that claims to represent you and invests in polluting industries, supporting campaigns to divest from those, whether it's migrant solidarity work, because we know that people are moving already because of climate breakdown, and they're going to move further. And so the kind of demonization and the criminalization of people who are trying to move for whatever reason is something we have to challenge, especially in light of the Windrush scandal. It means building local social justice movements, climate justice, social justice. Maybe here what you're doing with Yard is an instance of that, being rooted in your communities, making sure that people have access to space and capacity to access resources. Speaking about these things with your family and friends, particularly for those of us who have family and friends in the Caribbean, often when I talk to my relatives there, they'll know about the impacts of climate breakdown because they'll be seeing it in the shifting patterns of rainfall, or like the fact that the mango season has come early or late, or they didn't get enough water for the mango trees, or whatever it is. And supporting and platforming those people who on the front lines in the global south, who are already doing a lot of this work, right? Who are already fighting for these changes and these demands, and campaigning for truly international and just transition that doesn't just reproduce the harms of climate breakdown.
Sorry, can you hear back?
Sure, yeah. But yeah, like I said, I'd be really curious and interested to hear all of your thoughts and ideas as well about how we do this, how we push for justice, how we push for repair. So in summary, I kind of started out by talking about the impacts of climate breakdown being unevenly distributed, and the Caribbean being a region that's just significantly exposed to the harms, and that's not a natural phenomena that's produced by how we've organized our society. And the way that we've organized our societies is a legacy of empire. It's a legacy of colonialism and imperialism. We have to pay attention to that to understand it. And not only that, but the causes of climate breakdown are unevenly distributed. So some people, some companies, some countries are more responsible. They've benefited disproportionately, and they hold more responsibility because they are more implicated. That's why I think reparative justice is essential to addressing these inequalities. We can't understand a response that isn't reparative, in my opinion. Fair shares could be one example of how we try and calculate the role of, for instance, the UK, but there are lots of other examples. And the report that I shared earlier that came out a few days ago that talks about the $209 billion figure of fossil fuel companies owing, that again is another example. All right, I will shut up now, but thank you all for listening to me.
I was going to say, should we have a 5-minute break? And then,
I'm just because we're meant to finish at 2, so for Zoom joiners, it's only 10 minutes.
Let's finish at 2. How long was I supposed to speak for? I thought it was 50 minutes, or so I went to an hour. But...
That's fine.
it's okay.
No, you've done brilliantly.
Sorry.
No, I wonder if maybe if there's anyone that wanted to ask the question that can't.
Should we start with the Zoom?
Yeah, I just wonder if there's anyone on Zoom that really wanted to ask the question but can't stick around a little bit longer, then this might be a good time. Or if you're happy to stay with us a little bit longer, we can have a 5-minute break and then come back for questions. Any thought? Do you wanna like raise a hand if you want to ask a question, or give me a thumbs up if you're happy to take a break and come back? We got a thumbs up. Thumbs up. 3 thumbs up. Okay, amazing. All right, let's all take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 13:50, and have some questions.
I think Laura was waiting for a time to not interrupt your flow.
Thank you.
And also, I think Wangani has their hand raised, so if you want to come to that, and then
respond first.
It's up to you. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I have anything to add.
Yeah.
I think you put it well, and I think, I would agree. I feel like grassroots, that's the level at which I would place my faith and my efforts and my energy. I do feel like it's very fragmented at the moment, and I think that's part of the problem and part of why work such as this is so important, building community. So my new job, so I've kind of half left the university, partly because just the scale of things feels like that's not where I'm most useful. So I'm working for a community organizing organization, and that's just essentially support people at the grassroots level to push for things, to build community, to build change. And I feel like, that's a much more hopeful space, even though it's not easy work, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not saying it's like, everyone's all like, we'll do that. But that I have more faith that that's going to lead to the outcomes that we need than any of the formal political stuff. But I don't.
Yeah.
I thought you put it really well.
Was there a question on the Zoom?
Yeah, someone's got their hand up. It's Wangani.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it's Wangani. Yeah, thanks so much. I really, just enjoyed everything that was sort of said, and even the conversation as well afterwards as well. It's been really sort of invigorating and exciting. I'm an architect. We're working at Transition by Design, and one of the things that we've really been looking into is thinking about housing and retrofit justice, and thinking about that almost in a sense through a reparative lens. But then also we've been looking at thinking about the impact of intergenerational wealth and accessible secure housing. Anyway, to link this all back into the topic of today, I'm quite interested in hearing what your perspective might be on the role of the built environment and its relationship.
Exacerbator of climate injustice. Sorry.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Wangani.
That's fine. Just bringing it back into, I think, thinking about the role of the built environment and climate justice and reparations, just recognizing that the built environment is one of the largest contributors towards sort of climate-related issues and carbon emissions, but also actually acknowledging the impact of colonialism and the disparities that are evident within Caribbean and African communities in the UK.
So who's going to speak first? Seems like you both have something to say.
I just love this question because this is all in my bag. Like, I think that's one of the biggest conversations that I'm really interested in at the moment is the built environment. I don't know if people know how significant the contributions are to what is actually happening in and beyond this country. Like, we know, like, construction costs are on the up, but like the materiality, like all the processes, the practices, the investment, the labor, it's so tightly linked to, I think, multiple types of injustice, and the climate impacts are really central to so much of that. So I love this question, and it's raising loads of meaty things for me, because of course, you know, part of why we're having this conversation today is because we have got a built environment project on the horizon. And so we're also trying to say, you know, what do we not exacerbate? What do we not continue, even though the built environment has its defaults, the built environment has a rhythm, and there's a way in which we can so easily fall into that. So it's almost like, what do we need to be aware of to even know how to address that? And the other side of things is I've been teaching a module at Birmingham City University around architectures of abolition that says, how do we not only create the spaces of care, repair and transformation, and stop building carceral institutions, but what are the systems that would be needed for that to even be possible, for a built environment to acknowledge its own responsibility, its own sustenance of injustice and criminality. So Wangani, I know we're like so due a conversation, but thank you so much for being here, and I think we love to kick it after this for sure.
Definitely, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much.
Do you have anything to add?
I mean, I can add, but if there's more comments and questions, I feel like Lara, you know.
Is there anything in the chat? I can't remember. Adiola looks like they're going to ask a question. Oh, okay. Amazing.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, hi, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Hello, everyone. I just have a quick, I guess, a provocation. So I'm from Trinidad originally, and, you know, you're talking and I'm saying, oh my God, I wish my family back home was listening to this, you know? There's a kind of thing that we say that we own more water than land. And because we're islands, you know, we're islands. And with the global warming thing, we know that some of us most probably will be underwater, you know? So I guess my provocation is about, is there a way of looking at the sea or looking at water as territory, as a way of imagining the ocean as a space?
I consider myself a mad person, so that's in training.
I used to show the image in your slide with the prisons on the ship. And as sad as it was, I thought that was pretty cool. I'm not gonna lie. I thought it was really morbid of me, but I guess I've always thought about what happens in the year 3000 since Busted started singing it. And I thought, he said we're gonna be underwater. And how do we then make this a space where we do want to be? I love your idea, Adiola, so I'm down. I can't swim, but I'm down.
She can't swim.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting provocation. I've got this. I used to teach a course on apocalypse and apocalyptic narrative. So Waterworld was one of my reference points, where they're living on the boats and they have this kind of water-based societies. So there's that. But I guess my mind always goes towards the more like cynical possibility, which is to say that. So I did a project with someone from from Australia, but they work on the Pacific and work with Pacific Islander people. And we did a project looking at deep sea mining, because now, so one of the things with the energy transition, like the seabed, it's acknowledged, has all these kind of minerals and materials that are like quite highly valued. And in fact, they just moved the Seabed Authority to Jamaica not long ago, I think, or it's in the process of being moved there. So that's the body that is internationally responsible for like regulating extraction of the seabed and so on. And I guess I see that side very well advanced, the idea that we kind of commodify and carve up the sea as well as the land. I see those efforts much more advanced than our efforts to think about how we might relate to the sea as it encroaches, as it inundates, as it surrounds us in a way that would be more get us closer to some kind of transformation or transformative justice. Which isn't to say that there aren't ways of re-envisaging our relationship and learning from peoples who have much more seafaring lifestyles and who are more accustomed to relating to the sea. And indeed, that's one of the things that's kind of been lost with the push towards tourism and kind of the closing down of aquaculture and fisheries and things like that, is a loss of relationship to the sea. I don't know, I feel like there's a lot there, but I can't do it justice just now.
Was it Iceland or Greenland, one of the countries that kept on extending their border because other parts of Europe were encroaching and taking their fish because we were not fish and chips in Europe. And how it was this big thing about land and then trying to figure out, well, the land over that's above sea level is here, but how far does our ocean bed go? And it had never been that far, so I think they ended up changing the width so everyone could feel like their waters was theirs. But yeah, I think there is something in that.
I was just going to say something about like the fact that we are being very protective of the land because we are sort of losing the land to like natural disasters, landslides. But at the same time, we need to also be protective of the water. Like Adiola said, we own the water. In fact, we own more water technically than we own land. So like, for example, now there's deep sea mining. If would governments be, so our governments like currently, I don't know this, I'm just asking, are they like more skeptical or less skeptical of deep sea mining? Why is this kind of like an okay thing to move into? Is it because there's less attention being paid to the water surrounding the land? Is it because there's a focus like on the land itself? But yeah, like thinking of the water also as something that is something that I guess is required in order to live, might help in terms of like countries sort of not letting not only their land but like the space around their land, not letting that get taken for granted by groups or like people who might just want to extract resources. But yeah.
Can I respond to this? I think it was like there's fracking in the oceans that are hurting the whales Like Lizzie came out on the news yesterday, what's going on, the deep sea mining is like affecting the beings that are in nature. And then I think about like other parts of Jamaica where there's loads of groups that do loads of deep sea diving who have looked at the coral reefs, who started to then plant and do vegetations of coral reefs, and like there is this weird space of like how much do you intervene and what spaces are we allowed to intervene and what spaces are we not even bothering to because we've removed ourselves and our value.
No, I was just going to say we are coming up to time, so I'm just aware that we said that we'd finish at 2:15. Daniel has a hand up there and I feel bad. Daniel, is this a quick response or is this a reflection to share over email?
Yeah, I guess it's more a reflection in terms of like the reference about water. There's a district in Nigeria called Makoko, and they live literally on the water. I don't know if you can hear me. Reception might cut out.
It's good.
But okay, great, thank you. Yeah, and they live on top of water. Now there's big waste issues and kind of like sanitary and all these other issues that they're plagued by, and there's immense poverty. But there's a friend of mine, an architect, Umi Baden Powell. She kind of and a colleague, they went there to kind of propose this idea of designing some kind of a floating school, and they quickly got there and realized that the biggest issue wasn't, say, education, just livelihood, just living, and speaking to the fact that how these people make a life, how can you empower these people, how can they become their own, because there's no power, and a lot of them use gas and wasteful materials to kind of power the lights in their studio or to make clothing or to do anything. So they decided that they would focus on their immediate need and just design some kind of power solution. So they went about building some type of bio-waste unit that basically turned the waste into gas, basically, that they could then power their livelihoods. And it was called Okun Makoko, Power Makoko. And it was a kind of idea of turning the community into their own power station, into their own kind of sustainable, do for self, because the government ain't doing jack. So it was kind of like, let's turn these people into their own company and maybe they can harness that and sell that. I don't know, but yeah, in terms of like, I feel that's one reflection. And the other reflection is that so much of this is wrapped up in policy, and these are things that have tired us as people. So to kind of speak to that and try to go to that again, once again, it's kind of like a lot of us are uninspired by politics. And not only are we uninspired by politics, but even the issue of climate change is something which is, I don't think it's real to a lot of people, especially those in the diaspora. And maybe it's a cultural thing more so than a political thing. Because if it's a cultural thing, you're saying that in 5 years' time, the places that we know and love, we won't be able to kind of inhabit or, maintain a certain type of livelihood or wellness. That speaks to me more so than saying we need to lobby, we need to, although those are truths, I think the first thing we need to do is inspire people and try to inspire change, because this is such a great presentation, but it was so heavy that I'm kind of like, is it too late to even make any type of change? Because 5 years is literally like tomorrow, basically. So these are just reflections and these are just things I'm thinking, but I think creativity and problem solving is definitely something that we have to harness. And a lot of the speakers I resonate with. It's my 2 cents, really, just something kind of thought I'd share before I jump off.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Did you want to say anything in response to that, or shall we?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry for the heaviness. I think I talk about this so much that it doesn't hit me in the same way that it did. Like I've become, what's the word, like desensitized to the actual scale of what I'm talking about. And sometimes it's often when speaking to audiences and people are like, what did you just say? And I'm like, oh yeah, I did say that. That is actually pretty deep. So yeah, no, I think that's a really important reflection.
Well, thank you so much for today. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And I think, I totally agree that I think grassroots organisations are the best way to agitate change. And I hope that you'll all continue to join with us and ideate and build and genuinely grow alternatives. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Stay in touch. I'll email you any bibliographies that Leon sends my way. Lots of love. Join us soon.